Chapter 25. Dancing. The violin began taking shape the very next day. The luthier selected a mold, then glued 6 small blocks of spruce to its ends and corners. When the glue was dry, he trimmed the blocks to match a thin brass template. The ribs were cut and scraped, then bent on a hot piece of metal called a bending iron until they fit the mold perfectly. The luthier commented that he would allow the ribs to relax overnight, then bend them again the next day. He worked quickly, yet every action was well thought out and skillfully executed. Everything on the instrument seemed to be done in the expectation of it lasting forever. Over the next couple days, Richard gave a lot of thought to Cheryl's words, and he finally asked the luthier, "How long does a master violin last?" "If loved and cared for properly, at least 500 years. The luthier lowered his head. "I have also seen instruments destroyed in a single moment." "In an accident or a fire?" Richard watched and waited for an answer while the luthier finished carving a narrow channel around the edge of the violin's back where 3 small strips of wood called purfling would be inlaid. "That and other ways," replied the luthier. "I have seen great instruments which touched me deeply go into the hands of people for only a moment, then never be the same again. No matter how they are readjusted, no matter what strings are tried, they never sing with their true voices again. Usually, instruments can be brought back simply by being played on by someone who loves them deeply. But I have also seen times where they cannot." Richard could see the sadness in the luthier's eyes. It was as though he were talking about a close friend who had been horribly abused or died. "Do you really believe that violins have souls?" The luthier's eyes lifted. "You have been dreaming, haven't you?" "Yes, I have," Richard replied. He smiled while waiting for the luthier's answer. "I believe that true master instruments have something special. Call it a soul if you like. Unless made as a copy or an inferior instrument without love, each one has its own personality. It goes far beyond what any craftsman can accomplish with gouges, scrapers, and varnish brushes. I love my craft, and I believe that what I do is a gift from God. I also believe that every talent you possess is a gift from God, but I do not put the souls into the instruments. After all I can do to make the very best I can, the most important part comes from God and the performer. I can set the stage, but if there is something truly special when it's completed, it comes from the player and what they believe in." During the next week, Richard settled into a routine of practicing in the morning, visiting the violin shop in the afternoon, then practicing in the evening until he retired. He learned something new each day, and it was his desire to see every step of the violin-making process. The luthier was the only one who worked on the violin, just as Richard had imagined. And each day, Richard found the luthier carving the wood with the same attitude he might have imagined Michelangelo had while revealing the true form lying just beneath the surface of his greatest piece of roughly hewn marble. Richard walked in one afternoon and was surprised to see Cheryl standing in front of one of the workbenches, ready to assist the luthier. They glanced in his direction, then ignored him completely so they could concentrate on the task at hand. The overhead fan and air conditioner had been turned off, and the shop was sultry and hot. Suddenly, they both pulled 2 brushes out of a glue pot and applied the hot liquid around the violin's edge. The luthier worked with the back, while Cheryl applied a fine bead around the ribs. The brushes raced with lightning speed, and they finished the operation within seconds. The luthier turned the ribs over onto the back and instantly had them aligned with the help of small locating pins. The assembled pieces were cradled in an elaborate fixture, and everything was securely fastened before Richard had taken 2 more steps. They cleaned off the excess glue and finished the entire operation in less than a minute. Before Richard fully realized what was happening, his violin's back was completely glued onto the ribs with a single, perfect joint. It amazed him to think of what they had just accomplished. He had seen the same task take as much as an hour in other shops, where it was always done in small increments, leaving imperfect joints and tension in the wood. After sliding the violin and fixture to the back of the bench, the luthier smiled at Cheryl and thanked her. The luthier finally turned and acknowledged Richard. There are 2 operations that require assistance while making a master violin, and Cheryl is the only one I entrust my own life to, as well as those of my instruments. If one of our hands ever falter and the joint is not completed in time, all is lost. Richard inspected the fixture more closely and found almost 100 small clamps meticulously crafted into a large wood frame. It seemed a strange mixture of technology and craftsmanship. "How did you ever come up with it?" Richard asked. "France, 1694, replied the luthier. The violin began taking on its true form over the next few days, and each time Richard took his afternoon break, he started having strange feelings that he couldn't explain. The luthier noticed the change in Richard's attitude and finally offered, "To watch one's companion for life being operated on is difficult. If you allow me the analogy, many physicians will not perform surgery on their own wives because when they are finished, it is difficult to appreciate her beauty. Instead of a radiant, glowing smile and smooth, supple skin, all he can see afterwards are veins, muscles, and tissues. It is also difficult for most men to watch a doctor give their wife a physical." Richard nodded while beginning to understand. "I suppose you're right," agreed Richard. He had always looked at master violins as magnificent works of art. It was the first time that he had ever seen the pieces of an original master instrument lying separately on a table. Knowing that what he was looking at would become his instrument, possibly for the rest of his life, and that he must look at it as a work of art when completed, he agreed with the luthier's analogies. "If you need to ask anything, or would like to visit again, you are always welcome," offered the luthier, "but you may find it more comfortable if you only return when you feel that you should." "I believe you're right," replied Richard. "Besides, I've wanted to do some sightseeing and maybe even shoot a round of golf." With that, Richard left the luthier to the task at hand and drove back to St. George. Richard enjoyed exploring the desert over the next 2 weeks. Everything was so dead and desolate, yet seemed to breathe new life into him at the same time. There were a few people who recognized him, but for the most part, he could go anywhere he wanted and be treated just like everyone else. "It feels good for a change," he thought, while relaxing and looking out over a colorful valley from the top of a small mesa he had climbed. It made him think of a large concert stage, with the audience stretching out as far as the eye could see. He thought of the thrill of performing in the spotlight and the crowd rising to their feet and realized, but I wouldn't want to get used to it, at least not yet. Almost every night, as soon as Richard laid his head on his pillow, he dreamed. Most of his dreams were about Michelle and the good times they had shared, while others made no sense to him at all. Yet all of them left him with a pleasant feeling when he awoke. At the end of the third week, Richard had a very special dream. It was even more vivid than the people hanging from the ceiling. Only this dream was different, much different. He was awakened from a deep sleep in the middle of the desert. The sun rose quickly on the horizon, and the sand became scorching hot. He was soon mad with thirst, and looked at a lone Joshua tree and a few scattered sagebrush in the distance, wondering how he had gotten where he was. He started trudging across the endless expanse until his legs finally gave out. After falling to his knees, he started crawling, and the hot, burning sand scorched his hands and legs. When he felt he could go no further, he looked out across the horizon and saw a woman. Her form was barely visible and blurred by the heat waves rising from the sand. Richard squinted his eyes, then noticed that the woman was spinning around and slowly moving in his direction. As time passed, he could tell that the woman didn't have any clothes on, not even shoes to protect her feet. But it didn't matter. She danced across the sand. She held both arms outstretched with her head tilted back and her eyes closed. She was smiling and spinning, savoring the moment as if in pure ecstasy. Richard felt ashamed because he kept watching her come closer, but he was so miserable and she appeared so happy that he couldn't look away. The scorching sand was blistering Richard's hands, yet it didn't seem to bother the woman in the slightest. She was still far away, and the sun continued beating down on him until he finally collapsed. Even after his face hit the sand, he kept watching her. She continued spinning and smiling, with her arms stretched out and her soft, swirling hair extending past her shoulders. It was now much longer, yet he recognized its shimmering golden brown color, and it still had the small puff of curls at the end. As she turned one last time, Richard could clearly see the birthmark on the left side of her stomach. She knelt at Richard's side, and after lifting his chin and lovingly looking him in the eyes, she softly whispered the word, "Free." Richard jumped out of bed the next morning and got dressed. Halfway up the highway, he opened the window of the Blazer. The desert air was already hot, and by the time he pulled onto the gravel road leading to the violin shop, it was unbearable. Richard parked directly in front of the two serpents and looked up. He couldn't see anything from inside the Blazer, but he knew that it was there. He threw open the Blazer's door and ran up the ancient rock steps. It must be, he assured himself. He worried what the luthier might say, but decided not to let it stop him. The muscles in Richard's legs tightened, and he was out of breath, yet he maintained his pace all the way up to the top. When his eyes finally peered over the edge of the rock platform, he froze. There was the elegant silhouette of his white violin against the azure sky, soaking in the rays of the sun. It was a beautiful, creamy white color, waiting for its first coat of varnish. It had flowing shape and beautiful form without the slightest blemish or stain, except on the left side of its belly, where the wood had a distinct discoloration or birthmark.